I had dreamed about this moment for years. After 15 years on the force dealing with the worst society had to offer, I finally had enough saved for a down payment on a house in Oakwood Estates. The neighborhood represented everything I wanted for my family: tree-lined streets where my kids could ride bikes, good schools within walking distance, and a community where people actually knew their neighbors. The moving trucks pulled away on a crisp Saturday morning, leaving us surrounded by cardboard boxes and possibilities. "This is it, Sarah," I told my wife as we stood in our new living room. "No more apartment living. No more sharing walls with strangers. We finally have our own piece of America." Sarah smiled and wrapped her arms around me. "You deserve this, John. After everything you have seen on the job, you deserve some peace." If only peace had been what waited for us. The trouble started 3 days after we moved in. I had just returned from my shift and parked my police SUV in our driveway, as I always did. The vehicle was clearly marked but not flashy, standard department issue for officers authorized to take their vehicles home. A practical necessity in my line of work, nothing more. I was unpacking kitchen supplies when the doorbell rang with an impatient, staccato rhythm. On my porch stood a woman in her 50s with dyed blonde hair cut into a severe bob. She wore crisp khaki pants and a polo shirt with the neighborhood logo embroidered on the chest. Her lips were pursed into a thin line of disapproval. "Hello there," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I am Karen Williams, Vice President of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. I noticed you have an oversized vehicle parked in your driveway." I extended my hand. "Officer John Miller, nice to meet you, Karen. My family and I just moved in." She ignored my outstretched hand, instead flipping through pages on her clipboard. "Yes, well, regardless of your occupation, we have very specific rules about what can and cannot be parked in driveways. Section 14, Paragraph 3 of our covenant clearly states that no commercial, oversized, or specialty vehicles are permitted in residential driveways beyond temporary loading or unloading." I took a deep breath. I had dealt with difficult people my entire career, but I had not expected to face one on my own doorstep so soon. "My vehicle is a standard police-issue SUV," I explained calmly. "It is registered with the city and permitted for home use. I am an active duty officer, and department policy requires some officers to keep their vehicles accessible." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules, officer. This neighborhood maintains certain standards. Your police vehicle draws unnecessary attention and disrupts the aesthetic harmony we have worked so hard to maintain." "I understand you have concerns," I said, "but my vehicle usage falls under municipal exemptions that supersede HOA regulations. I would be happy to provide documentation." "We will see about that," Karen replied, her voice hardening. "The board takes these violations very seriously. I suggest you find alternative arrangements immediately." She turned on her heel and marched back down my walkway, her shoulders rigid with indignation. As she retreated, I noticed several neighbors quickly ducking back into their homes. They had been watching the interaction with interest but clearly wanted no part in the conflict. Sarah appeared beside me. "What was that about?" "Just a welcome committee with an unusual greeting," I replied, trying to keep things light. But inside, alarm bells were ringing. In my years as an officer, I had seen how petty authority could escalate into genuine harassment. The next morning confirmed my suspicions. As I prepared to leave for my shift, I found a bright red violation notice secured under my windshield wiper. The paper was emblazoned with "official violation" in bold letters, listing my infraction in excessive detail. At the bottom was Karen's signature, alongside a notice that continued violations would result in fines starting at $100 per day. I carefully removed the notice, folded it, and placed it in my pocket. In 15 years of police work, I had learned to choose my battles wisely. This, I realized as I slid behind the wheel of my SUV, was going to be one worth fighting. Not just for me, but for every homeowner who had ever felt bullied by someone drunk on minimal power. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. in the community center, a single-story building with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that somehow managed to make everyone look ill. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying a folder containing everything I needed. Department vehicle policies, municipal codes that superseded HOA regulations, and photographic evidence that several other homes in the neighborhood had vehicles similar to or larger than mine. The room filled quickly. Neighbors filed in and took seats on folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Some nodded politely in my direction. Others averted their eyes. I recognized the pattern from countless interrogation rooms, the behavior of people who sensed conflict and wanted to avoid being caught in the crossfire. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Karen strode in, flanked by 3 other board members. She wore a navy blazer with the HOA logo prominently displayed, her posture suggesting she was presiding over a court rather than a community meeting. Beside her shuffled an older gentleman with thinning gray hair whom she introduced as Mr. Daniels, the HOA president. "Welcome, everyone," Karen announced without waiting for Mr. Daniels to speak. "We have several items on our agenda tonight, but first, let us address the recent violations that have been issued." Her eyes locked on mine, and she continued without breaking her gaze. "It has come to our attention that some new residents are attempting to circumvent our clearly established covenants regarding vehicle restrictions. These rules exist to protect our property values and maintain the character of Oakwood Estates." I raised my hand, waiting to be acknowledged. Karen pretended not to see me for several minutes before reluctantly gesturing in my direction. "Officer Miller, would you like to share something with the group?" I stood and faced the room. "Thank you. I would like to address the violation notice I received regarding my police vehicle. I have brought documentation confirming that official vehicles are exempt from such restrictions under City Ordinance 47.3, which supersedes HOA regulations." I moved forward to distribute copies of the documentation, but Karen intervened. "That will not be necessary," she said sharply. "We are quite familiar with the municipal codes. However, the presence of uniformed vehicles creates an environment of surveillance and intimidation that many residents find unsettling." A murmur rippled through the room. I scanned the faces, noting the uncertainty. Karen was weaponizing fear, a tactic I had seen countless times. "With all due respect," I responded, "my vehicle is no different from an electrician's van or a doctor who brings home a medical transport. The difference is merely in function. It serves our community by ensuring rapid response times and increased neighborhood security." An older woman toward the back nodded in agreement, but quickly stopped when Karen glared in her direction. Mr. Daniels cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should put this matter to a vote at the next meeting, after everyone has had time to review the relevant policies." Karen's smile was tight. "An excellent suggestion. In the meantime, all issued violations stand. Now, moving on to the matter of seasonal decorations." The meeting continued for another hour, but the message was clear. This was not about rules or aesthetics. This was about Karen establishing dominance in her territory. I had invaded that territory, and worse, I had challenged her authority. As the meeting disbanded, neighbors filtered out quickly. No one wanted to be seen speaking with me. I gathered my untouched documents and headed toward the exit, where a younger couple stopped me briefly. "That was brave," the woman whispered. "No one ever stands up to her." Her husband glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Be careful, though. She has ways of making life difficult." They hurried away before I could respond, leaving me with an uneasy feeling that followed me home. Sarah was waiting up, eager to hear how the meeting had gone. "Not great," I admitted, sinking onto the couch. "It seems our HOA vice president has quite the iron grip on this place." Sarah squeezed my hand. "You deal with dangerous criminals every day. Surely one neighborhood busybody is nothing to worry about." I wished I could share her optimism, but something told me this conflict was just beginning. That night, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sound of something hitting our house around 2 a.m. In the morning light, the evidence was unmistakable. Dried egg yolk streaked down the side of my SUV, hardened in the night air. I photographed the damage before cleaning it off, adding the images to my growing file. 15 years of police work had taught me the value of documentation. Every incident, every interaction would be recorded from now on. Karen had fired the first shot in what was quickly becoming a neighborhood Cold War. 2 weeks passed in uneasy détente. I continued to park my SUV in the driveway, and Karen continued to leave violation notices, each one more strongly worded than the last. My fines had theoretically accumulated to over $1,400, though I had no intention of paying a cent. It was Wednesday afternoon when the call came through. I was at the station finishing paperwork when dispatch announced a 911 call reporting a suspicious vehicle in a residential area. The address made me freeze mid-signature. It was my house. "Dispatch, can you confirm that address?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Confirmed, Officer Miller." Female caller reporting an unmarked police vehicle parked in a private driveway, requesting immediate investigation. My supervisor, Captain Reynolds, overheard the exchange and raised an eyebrow. I quickly explained the ongoing situation with Karen and the HOA. "This is harassment, plain and simple," Captain Reynolds said. "A waste of emergency resources. Normally I would send Ramirez, but would you like to handle this one yourself?" I considered the question carefully. "Yes, sir. I believe it would be educational for all parties involved." 20 minutes later, I pulled my patrol car onto my street. Several neighbors were out on their lawns, alerted either by the 911 call or by Karen herself, who stood imperiously at the edge of my driveway. She was dressed in a tennis outfit, as though she had been interrupted mid-activity, though the pristine whiteness of her clothes suggested otherwise. I parked directly behind my SUV, activated my body camera, and stepped out in full uniform. Karen did not immediately recognize me. She was too busy gesturing emphatically at my parked vehicle. "That is the one," she declared loudly. "It has been there for weeks, despite multiple notices. I believe it may be an impersonation situation. No real officer would so flagrantly disregard community standards." I approached with measured steps. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I understand you have called about a suspicious vehicle." Karen nodded vigorously. "Yes, thank you for responding so promptly. As you can see, this police vehicle has been." She stopped mid-sentence as recognition dawned. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. "I am Officer John Miller, badge number 4572, I stated formally. I am responding to a 911 call about a suspicious vehicle at this address. Would that be your call, ma'am? Color drained from Karen's face. There must be some mistake. I was merely reporting. You called emergency services to report a vehicle parked in its owner's driveway, I continued, maintaining a professional tone. Are you aware that misuse of emergency services is a criminal offense under state law? By now, a small crowd had gathered. Karen's tennis outfit suddenly seemed less crisp as she began to perspire visibly. I was concerned about public safety, she stammered. How was I supposed to know it was actually your house? The vehicle has been reported multiple times to the HOA, and I thought perhaps someone was impersonating an officer. I removed my notepad and began writing. So you were aware this was a police vehicle, and you were aware it belonged to a resident, yet you still deemed this an emergency situation. That is not what I said. Karen's voice rose shrilly. You are twisting my words. I was performing my duty as a concerned citizen. Ms. Williams, is it? I verified, though I knew perfectly well who she was. I am going to issue you a formal warning for misuse of emergency services. Further incidents could result in fines or criminal charges. I wrote the warning deliberately, taking my time as the neighbors watched. When I handed her the yellow slip, her hand trembled slightly. This is harassment, she hissed, low enough that only I could hear. You cannot use your position to intimidate me. I am simply responding to a call, ma'am, as is my duty, I replied evenly. Have a good day. I returned to my patrol car, aware that every eye in the vicinity was on me. As I pulled away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Karen remained rooted to the spot, the yellow warning slip clutched in her hand, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. Back at the station, Captain Reynolds was waiting for an update. How did your neighborhood HOA enthusiast respond? He asked. She was surprised to see me, I replied, though I suspect this is not the end of it. Captain Reynolds nodded grimly. Watch your back, Miller. People with a little power and a lot of time can be more dangerous than you might expect. His words proved prophetic. The battle lines had been drawn, and Karen had just suffered her first public defeat. I knew enough about human nature to recognize that this would only intensify her determination. The war for Oakwood Estates was just beginning. The formal complaint arrived by certified mail 5 days later. The envelope bore the official HOA letterhead, but the vindictiveness within was pure Karen. The document alleged that I had abused my position as a law enforcement officer to intimidate and harass a civilian volunteer performing her community duties. It further claimed that I had deliberately embarrassed a respected HOA board member in public as retaliation for proper enforcement of community standards. Sarah read it over my shoulder, her expression darkening with each paragraph. This is ridiculous. She called 911 on our house. I folded the letter carefully and added it to my growing file. It is not about logic. It is about saving face. She lost ground publicly, so now she needs to reclaim it formally. The letter concluded with a warning that further intimidation tactics would result in legal action against both me personally and potentially the police department. A separate sheet indicated that my accumulated fines now exceeded $2,000 and outlined a payment plan for my convenience. The impact of Karen's campaign extended beyond paperwork. At the grocery store that weekend, people who had previously greeted us warmly suddenly found reasons to switch aisles when they saw us coming. Parents who had invited our children to playdates now responded with vague excuses about busy schedules. The isolation crystallized when a neighborhood-wide email announced a block party the following Saturday. Every home on our street was specifically mentioned in the invitation, except ours. When our 8-year-old daughter asked why we were not going, the truth stuck in my throat. "Some neighbors are just still getting to know us, sweetie," Sarah explained, shooting me a look that mixed equal parts sadness and anger. That Saturday, we took the kids to a water park an hour away, but we could not escape the sound of music and laughter floating over the fence when we returned. Our daughter pressed her face against the living room window, watching children she recognized from school playing games in the street. "Why do they not like us, Dad?" she asked. The question hit me like a physical blow. I had faced armed suspects and dangerous situations without hesitation, but seeing my child hurt by deliberate exclusion awoke something primal within me. "Sometimes adults have disagreements," I said carefully, "but that does not mean there is anything wrong with us." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and I sat on the back patio. The remnants of the block party, distant voices and occasional laughter still hung in the air. "This has gone too far," Sarah said quietly. "It is one thing to harass us, but involving the children." I nodded, my decision already made. Tomorrow I start fighting back, the right way. The following morning, I received another indirect blow. A fellow officer stopped me in the station hallway, his expression uncomfortable. "Hey, Miller, the captain wants to see you." Captain Reynolds did not mince words. "The department received a formal complaint about you from your HOA. Normally, I would file it directly in the trash, but there are allegations of intimidation while in uniform. I have to ask, did you respond to a call at your own address?" "Yes, sir. It was a reported suspicious vehicle, my own SUV in my own driveway, everything by the book, body cam activated throughout." He nodded. "I figured as much. Still, there is pressure coming from somewhere. Your HOA president made calls to the commissioner. Nothing will come of it officially, but you might want to tread carefully." I left his office with a growing realization. Karen had connections beyond our little neighborhood. This was no longer just about a parking space or community aesthetics. She was actively trying to damage my professional reputation and personal life. The stakes had risen, and it was time to change my approach. That night, I set up a security camera system covering every angle of our property. I began carrying a pocket recorder whenever I was in the neighborhood, and I started making phone calls to people who might help me understand exactly what I was up against. If Karen wanted a war, she would get one fought with evidence, procedure, and the full weight of the law. My first step was methodical documentation. Every violation notice, every email, every recorded conversation, I organized them chronologically in a dedicated folder. My years in law enforcement had taught me that patterns reveal truth, and Karen's behavior definitely showed a pattern. I installed a dash cam in my personal vehicle and positioned home security cameras strategically. Within days, they captured Karen taking photos of our house, inspecting our mailbox, and once even measuring the height of our grass with a ruler. Each intrusion was dated, time-stamped, and added to the file. But the real breakthrough came when I started talking to other neighbors, carefully, one by one, away from prying eyes. I began with the young couple who had whispered encouragement after the HOA meeting. We met at a coffee shop 20 minutes from the neighborhood. Mike and Jennifer Chen had lived in Oakwood Estates for 3 years and had their own Karen stories to tell. She cited us for having a basketball hoop in our driveway, Mike explained. Said it lowered property values, but the Henderson family 2 streets over has one exactly like it. The difference? They are on the HOA board. Jennifer leaned forward, and when we applied to install solar panels, which are legally protected by state law, she blocked it for months, claiming they were visually disruptive. We finally had to hire an attorney. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" I asked, anonymously, of course. They exchanged glances. "We have kids in the neighborhood schools," Jennifer said hesitantly. "We cannot afford to become targets." "I understand completely," I assured them. "No names would be used." By the end of 2 weeks, I had spoken with 11 households, each with similar experiences. A Hispanic family reported being cited for excessive occupancy when their grandparents visited for a month. An elderly widower received weekly violations about his garden being non-standard. A woman with disabilities faced opposition to a small ramp installation. The pattern was unmistakable. Karen's enforcement was selective, discriminatory, and often in direct violation of state and federal housing laws. But most victims stayed silent, afraid of becoming further targets or unwilling to engage in protracted conflict. Armed with anonymous testimonies and my own extensive documentation, I contacted the County Housing Authority. The clerk who answered sounded unsurprised. "Oakwood Estates, you are not the first to call about them, but most complaints get withdrawn before we can investigate." "This one will not be withdrawn," I promised. Next, I reached out to a civil rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination. When I laid out the evidence during our consultation, her eyes widened. "This is exactly the kind of case we look for," she said, reviewing the patterns of selective enforcement. HOAs wield tremendous power, but they are still bound by fair housing laws and basic due process. What you are describing here goes well beyond overzealous rule enforcement. She agreed to take the case on contingency, believing the evidence was strong enough to warrant county intervention. 2 days later, I received a call that changed everything. "Officer Miller, this is Jessica Barnes from Community Justice Legal Aid. We reviewed the materials you submitted to the county. We would like to expand your complaint into a class action on behalf of all affected residents. Would you be willing to serve as the primary complainant?" For the first time in months, I felt the weight lifting. This was no longer just my fight against a neighborhood tyrant. This was about protecting an entire community from systematic abuse of power. With the legal aid group's resources behind me, we filed a formal complaint requesting a county investigation into discriminatory enforcement practices by the Oakwood Estates HOA. The machinery of justice turned slowly, but it was turning, and Karen had no idea what was coming. The official notice of investigation arrived at every home in Oakwood Estates simultaneously. A county action that could not be intercepted or controlled by the HOA board. The letter announced a formal hearing to address allegations of discriminatory enforcement, procedural violations, and potential conflicts of interest within the HOA leadership. The hearing was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. on a Tuesday at the County Administration Building downtown. I took the day off, arriving an hour early in a suit and tie rather than my uniform. I wanted to be seen as a homeowner, not a police officer attempting to leverage professional authority. The room gradually filled with familiar faces. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now nodded in cautious acknowledgement. Jessica Barnes from Legal Aid sat beside me, organized files spread before her. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the three-person panel from the County Housing Authority entered and called the session to order. Karen arrived last, flanked by Mr. Daniels and another board member. She wore a conservative navy dress and minimal jewelry, a calculated attempt to appear professional and reasonable. Our eyes met briefly across the room. Her expression remained neutral, but I detected the first flickers of genuine concern. The hearing began with an overview of the complaints. The head commissioner, a stern woman with silver-framed glasses, addressed the room. "We have received multiple allegations regarding the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association's enforcement practices. Today, we will hear testimony from affected residents, review documentary evidence, and determine whether there are grounds for county intervention." Jessica presented our case first, methodically outlining the pattern of selective enforcement. "What we see here is not merely strict rule adherence, but targeted harassment based on arbitrary and often discriminatory criteria." She played the recording of Karen's 911 call about my vehicle, obtained through proper legal channels, and presented side-by-side photographic evidence showing identical violations treated differently depending on who committed them. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my testimony factual and unemotional. As both a law enforcement officer and a homeowner, I believe in rules that are applied fairly and consistently. What I have experienced and documented is the opposite: targeted enforcement used as a weapon against residents who question authority or simply do not fit a certain profile. One by one, other residents came forward. The elderly widower described receiving fines for his vegetable garden, while decorative gardens of board members went uncited. The Chen family presented their legal bills from fighting the solar panel obstruction. Most powerful was testimony from Mrs. Ramirez, who had been told her family gathering looked like a party requiring special permission when her relatives visited for her daughter's quinceañera. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the evidence mounted. When her turn to respond came, she adopted an air of wounded professionalism. "These allegations are simply untrue," she began. "Our covenant enforcement is applied equally to all residents. Officer Miller has a personal vendetta because he believes his profession should exempt him from rules that everyone else follows. As for the other complaints, many involve residents who have multiple violations besides the ones they have mentioned today." She presented her own folder of documentation, violation notices, email threads, and photographs of supposed infractions. But in the clinical light of the hearing room, without the power dynamics of the neighborhood behind her, her evidence seemed petty and obsessive. Mr. Daniels spoke next, his voice hesitant. "The board has always tried to maintain the character and value of our community. If enforcement has seemed inconsistent, it was never intentional." The commissioners asked pointed questions about the HOA's written procedures, documentation of violations, and appeals process. With each answer, it became clearer that the board operated on subjective judgments rather than consistent standards. The final blow came when Jessica presented financial records, showing that fine revenue had increased 340% since Karen joined the board, with no corresponding increase in community improvements or services. The evidence suggests that enforcement has become a revenue-generating mechanism rather than a community benefit, Jessica concluded. After 4 hours of testimony, the head commissioner removed her glasses and addressed the room. Based on the evidence presented, this panel finds substantial cause to believe that the Oakwood Estates HOA has engaged in discriminatory enforcement practices, procedural violations, and potential misuse of authority. We are issuing an immediate cease and desist on all pending violations until a full audit can be completed. She turned specifically toward the HOA representatives. Furthermore, We are ordering a supervised election of an entirely new board within 60 days, with county oversight. No current board member may stand for re-election for a period of at least 2 years. Karen's face flushed deep red. She began to protest, but her attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm, whispering urgently in her ear. Whatever he said silenced her immediately. As the hearing adjourned, neighbors who had once avoided me now approached with smiles and handshakes. The atmosphere had shifted palpably. For the first time since moving in, I felt like part of a community rather than an outsider. Justice had prevailed not through force or intimidation, but through proper channels and the rule of law, exactly as it should be. The changes in Oakwood Estates unfolded gradually over the following weeks. The first was physical. A "for sale" sign appeared on Karen's front lawn exactly 17 days after the hearing. No announcement was made, no goodbyes exchanged, but word spread quickly through the now liberated neighborhood grapevine. "Did you see?" Jennifer Chen asked when we crossed paths while retrieving our mail. "No asking price listed. She must be in a hurry." Indeed, Karen seemed determined to exit as quickly and quietly as possible. A moving company arrived on a Tuesday morning, efficiently loading her possessions into a truck that departed before most neighbors returned from work. The "for sale" sign gained a price REDUCED banner 2 weeks later, and finally a "sold" sticker by the end of the month. With Karen gone, the neighborhood exhaled collectively. Children played more freely in front yards. Neighbors lingered in conversations rather than hurrying behind closed doors. The interim HOA board, appointed by the county until elections could be held, adopted a hands-off approach focused on essential maintenance rather than micromanagement. I continued to park my SUV in the driveway, washing it every Saturday morning in full view of anyone passing by. What had once been an act of defiance gradually transformed into a simple routine, just a man caring for his vehicle on a weekend morning. Spring arrived with an explosion of colorful flowers and renewed energy. The Ramirez family planted a vibrant garden without fear of citations. The elderly Mr. Peterson installed a small bench beside his rose bushes, a minor covenant violation under the old regime that now drew compliments instead of complaints. Sarah suggested we host a neighborhood barbecue to properly introduce ourselves. I hesitated briefly, still carrying the emotional scars of our previous isolation, but agreed it was time to fully embrace our place in the community. We sent invitations to every home on our street and the adjacent cul-de-sac. The response was overwhelming, not just acceptances, but offers to bring side dishes, desserts, and extra folding chairs. On a perfect Saturday afternoon in May, our backyard filled with neighbors who now felt like friends. Mike Chen raised his glass in an impromptu toast. To Officer Miller, who showed us that standing up to bullies does not require becoming one. Applause rippled through the gathering. I felt my face warming with unexpected emotion. "I did not do it alone," I responded. "It took all of us finding the courage to speak up." Later, as children played tag across several connected backyards, fence boundaries temporarily forgotten, Mr. Daniels approached me. He had resigned from the board immediately after the hearing and now looked years younger, the perpetual worry lines around his eyes notably diminished. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I should have stood up to her years ago. I convinced myself I was minimizing conflict, but I was really just enabling a tyrant." I offered him a handshake. We all make compromises we later regret. The important thing is that the community has found its voice again. As evening fell, neighbors lingered, reluctant to end the celebration. String lights twinkled overhead, and conversations flowed easily among people who had previously regarded each other with suspicion. My SUV sat in the driveway, no longer a symbol of conflict but simply part of the landscape. The county-supervised HOA elections took place the following month. The new board consisted of a diverse group committed to transparency and minimal intervention, including Jennifer Chen and Mrs. Ramirez. Their first official act was to revise the covenant enforcement procedures, requiring documented consistency and establishing a fair appeals process. Life settled into pleasant normalcy. Weekend cookouts became regular events rotating between homes. Children formed summer friendships unrestrained by adult conflicts. The neighborhood began to embody the community I had imagined when we first moved in. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on our front porch watching neighborhood children play, a patrol car slowed in front of our house. The window rolled down to reveal Officer Ramirez, a rookie I had mentored. "How is civilian life treating you, Miller?" he called. I gestured to the peaceful scene before us. "No complaints here, just enjoying being part of a real community." He nodded appreciatively. "Word around the station is you took down an entire HOA without firing a shot. Impressive tactical work." I laughed. "Not taken down, just realigned with what it should have been all along. Sometimes the system works if you give it a chance." As his patrol car pulled away, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out. I could have escalated the conflict, used my position to intimidate, or simply moved away in frustration. Instead, patience and proper procedures had transformed not just our situation, but an entire neighborhood's culture. My SUV still sat in the driveway every night, no longer an act of defiance, but simply a vehicle serving its purpose. And in that ordinary normality lay the greatest victory of all.